fourth issue of the barometer, which tracks the pre-election period between January to end of April. So it tracks 9 indicators, which are the voters' roll, hate speech, vote buying, violence and intimidation, political tolerance, media access, party campaign finance, voter education, election administration, and then gives an overall assessment of the period that we assessed. I think I did not introduce myself. My name is Colin Chibambo. I'm a researcher at the Election Resource Center. With me is the Executive Director of the Election Resource Center, Mr. Tawanda Chimhini, and our Programmes Coordinator, Ms. Tatenda Makanza. So having given the objective of why we are here, simply to launch this barometer, I would just like to say 1 or 2 things about how we went about assessing the indicators that I talked about. First of all, we conducted focus group discussions in 8 focus group discussions in 8 districts across the country in the 10 provinces that we have. So we did 8 districts, being Mutasa, Mutare, Chirezi, Bikita, Mzingwane, Cholocho, and Slovela. These focus group discussions were homogeneous in the sense that when we did a focus group discussion with women, it was only women. If we did a focus group discussion with persons living with disabilities, it was only with them. If we did one with women, it was only with women. We also conducted extensive literature review of what other election stakeholders have said about certain aspects, certain indicators that we were assessing. For example, on violence and intimidation, we would look at reports from Zimbabwe, from Zimbabwe Peace Project, from the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, and assess those reports and back it up with what we would have found on the ground. We also did key informant interviews with councillors, with traditional leaders. We also did key informant interviews with ZEC officials in 5 districts across the country. So having done that, we came up with assessments of each of the indicator and the overall assessment, which my director will then speak to. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So, again, thanks to Colin for the background information with regards to this barometer. Now, in addition to what Colin has said, the intention of the barometer is to periodically assess progress that is being made in preparation for the elections. And we are particularly interested in doing this given our understanding that elections are not a process, they are an event. Now we're 2 months before the next election. I think we're about 55 days now before the next election. My math is bad, but we are just around 55 days before the next election. And the big question of the day is, how far are we in terms of fully preparing for these elections? So the intention of the barometer is to allow ourselves an opportunity to reflect on the steps that we've taken as a country towards having this election. Not an election in terms of the date, but an election in terms of the process that are crucial for us to then say our election is credible, it's free, and it's fair in accordance to what the President has said. The intention as well is to assist policymakers, those that run elections, to focus on areas where we are not necessarily performing well. By publishing these findings, the intention is that where we are stating that we're falling short, there is an immediate attempt by those that are in authority to consider how they can address some of these shortcomings. But also an opportunity to celebrate the successes that we're witnessing in our preparation for the elections. So where we've done well, the barometer to us is an opportunity for us to say, yes, we've done well and we've done well here. And again, as we do this, the intention is to build a credible election process. At the end of the day, we do not want to simply pass a verdict and cry about the quality of our elections at the end of the process or when results are announced, when we can actually contribute to improving the processes they are being undertaken now. So the context of this assessment is that we have groups that have already been invited by the government to come and observe our elections. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have over 65 such groups that are coming into Zimbabwe. This context is important because this is the first time that we as a country have such a huge contingent of international observers watching our process. Again, in terms of defining our context as well, we are also fully cognizant of the fact that in addition to the international observers that have been invited, we do have Zimbabweans and Zimbabwean organizations that are also tracking the election process. So this, in our view, provides a very fertile ground to collect information relating to what our what our elections are about and what's going on with our own elections. But also, more importantly, to articulate as Zimbabweans where others are going to be joining us to articulate the same, what we have seen as Zimbabweans. I think more than anything, the Zimbabwean perspective on our own elections is important, and the international perspective, as will be given by international observers, should complement what we as Zimbabweans are seeing in our own elections, because we have also been allowed to track our own elections. Now, overall speaking, as Colin indicated, we are tracking about 9 indicators in the pre-election phase of the election cycle. As indicated, this assessment covers a period between January and April 2018, and if you're following the election cycle, this is the pre-election phase of the election cycle. This is a period where voter registration processes have to be undertaken. This is a period where voter education must be conducted. This is a period where the election administration body must begin preparing for elections. This is also the period where political parties begin to engage with communities. So during this period, we were tracking issues relating to the voters' roll. We were tracking issues relating to voter education. We were tracking issues relating to the environment, particularly focusing on the issues around hate speech, political violence, and intimidation, and vote buying. We were also tracking issues relating to media access, particularly state media access. We were also tracking issues relating to the election administration and the question of financing of political parties. From our assessment during this period between January and April 2018, we noted positive findings. Firstly, in terms of the continuous voter registration process undertaken by the Election Commission, where we observed that the Election Commission did make strides in terms of complying with the legal provisions regarding continuous voter registration and responding to calls for an extended version of the process after it had completed the first 4 phases of the voter registration process that were launched in September 2017. We also observed positive findings in terms of the percentage of registration that the Election Commission indicated. This is primarily based on the information that ZEC gave, and we cannot independently verify this information, but it was commendable to notice that 73.5% of eligible voters had been registered to vote by February 2018, and we thought this was quite commendable. 73% is a high rate of registration by any standards. So if this is verified, and unfortunately the Election Commission has not given an opportunity for an independent verification of this, this would be highly commendable. Then we also noted positively that there was moderate political tolerance amongst citizens across the country and among some election stakeholders, although we were able to witness some intra-party violence being characterizing, so to speak, part of the pre-election environment. We also noted that the election management body was largely competent and professional in some instances, but they lagged behind on issues of transparency and accountability, which we found is very unfortunate. So we will get into details of some of these positive findings and qualifying some of the things that we have indicated. Negatively, unfortunately, we witnessed through our interaction with communities across the districts that we sampled that the majority of citizens, particularly in rural communities, expressed a sense of fear associated with the upcoming elections. This was despite the fact that the environment was largely violence-free. So there was a thinking by communities that we interacted with that in as much as there was no violence, the fear of violence visiting upon them once the election was called was high. And this fear of violence, in our view, had a very devastating effect in terms of citizen participation in the electoral processes that were being rolled out. Negatively as well, we were able to witness rampant vote buying, particularly in rural communities, where again political actors started to deploy resources in relation to citizen participation around elections, which was really unfortunate. And again, vote buying has a bearing on how citizens express themselves in their participation in electoral processes, never mind how they vote at the end of the day. We were also able to witness, unfortunately negatively, that there was some level of intimidation, in fact, extensive levels of intimidation in relation to the issue of the demand for serial numbers of voter registration slips by some political parties, particularly Zanu-PF. Again, intimidation has a bearing in terms of capturing voters way before an election and potentially influencing how voters will vote, especially if such intimidation is accompanied by threats if one does not comply with the instructions to share the serial numbers. We were able to witness low voter registration, particularly in urban areas of Harare and Bulawayo, where Harare registered 63% rate of registration and Bulawayo registered 59% rate of registration. In our view, this was unfortunate and could have been mitigated against had the Election Commission considered some innovations around compelling or at least incentivizing registration in these urban areas. Then we were also able to witness limited transparency and accountability with respect to the issues relating to accountability around political party financing. So we would understand that political parties, particularly those that are represented in parliament, are funded through public funds. And there are provisions in the Political Parties Finance Act that demand that these political parties be accountable for the usage of public resources that they do access. So there was limited transparency and accountability on the part of the political parties in terms of how such funds were used, and we witnessed this. Then we were also, unfortunately, witnesses to an increase in hate speech at political rallies across the political divide, where slogans were used to denigrate others, to denigrate opponents, and this again has a bearing in terms of contributing towards the credibility of our next election. That being said, our overall assessment of the period between January and April indicates that on the basis of the 9 indicators that we're tracking, we are performing at a very average rate. More could have been done to ensure that we as a country moved towards guaranteeing credible, free and fair election ahead of this election by addressing some of the inadequacies that I have noted based on the 9 indicators. I will proceed to state key findings based on the actual indicators that we are tracking. So number 1, in terms of the voters' roll as an indicator, we noted that compilation of the voters' roll remained ongoing during the assessment period. An accurate and current and complete voters' roll, this is based on principles related to how a voters' roll should be compiled. So an accurate, current and complete voters' roll is yet to be finalized. In our view, challenges were noted in accessing information relating to the process of compiling the voters' roll, with ZEC only releasing partial information around their work, around the creating a voters' roll. Access to the provisional roll, as we all witnessed recently, was not guaranteed at the time of the assessment. And up until now, the Election Commission has still not publicly shared the voters' roll. So based on principles, key principles, which are associated with coming up with a voters' roll, we have performed below average because of the limited access to key information that would point us to the direction in which we are moving ahead of preparing a credible voters' roll. So it may be premature to give a rating on the voters' roll itself at this stage, but processes leading up to this compilation of the roll have fallen short of satisfying international standards that should be adhered to in terms of coming up with a voters' roll. In the same breath, the Election Commission has also failed to fully comply with the provisions of our own laws in terms of making information accessible with respect to how a voters' roll should be compiled. So we have performed below average with regard to the issue of the voters' roll as things currently stand, but also in full cognizance of the fact that the voters' roll is still to be finalized, so we continue to be tracking our performance with respect to the voters' roll. In terms of hate speech, we have performed again below average in terms of the question of hate speech. Hate speech, like I noted, has been recorded largely during political rallies, through political slogans. Citizens that we engaged with indicated that such expression of hate speech was largely confined to leaders of political parties, and this was quite disturbing, although it had not necessarily cascaded to lower levels of the community at the time of the assessment. Some of the noted hate speech from our findings included demeaning and insulting political opponents. What is particularly devastating about the hate speech that we witnessed during the assessment period is that there are little to no measures being undertaken to mitigate against hate speech. So it is currently being witnessed and perpetuated through the media. The Election Commission has not yet set up mechanisms that should address the question of hate speech. And from previous experience, hate speech has a bearing on the credibility, freeness, and fairness of elections. And the sad reality is that we are performing below average in terms of addressing the issues of hate speech. In terms of vote buying, our assessment indicates that nearly 70% of people that we engaged with in the sampled areas that we noted have actually been recipients of bribes relating to elections. So vote buying was quite rampant during the assessment period and continues to be, with candidates and political parties using resources to entice voters to participate in political gatherings, to participate in electoral processes, to influence how potential voters may act once elections have been called and elections do happen. Although such rampant vote buying was witnessed in rural communities, in urban communities, we also noted the same, although at a limited level. We were able to get feedback that some citizens in towns were recipients, again, of some of the incentives that are being given in terms of rice, food aid, and so on. Our worry regarding hate speech, vote buying, relates to the fact that there are limited mechanisms currently deployed to address hate speech, which, according to our own electoral act, is a violation of the law. So where such distribution of incentives to voters happens in relation to elections, this is in violation of the Electoral Act, and our belief is that the Election Commission must deploy measures to curb this, and such measures should be punitive enough to deter the practice. With respect to violence and intimidation, during the assessment period, again from January to April this year, there were limited reports of incidences of physical violence captured in our assessment. However, a number of incidences pertaining to intimidation were recorded throughout the country, mostly focused in rural communities. In our assessment, such intimidation was largely being instigated by traditional leaders and political party activists, and related to the demand for registration certificate serial numbers. In terms of this, again, what is particularly worrying from our observation is that no adequate measures have been deployed, at least during this assessment period, had been deployed in order to address issues of political violence and intimidation. So a lot of the intimidation went on with extensive impunity, and those that have been tracking violence in electoral processes will understand that violence is, of course, very devastating, but what makes it even more dangerous as a practice is the impunity that is associated with it. This is a constant reminder to victims that those that perpetuate some of this intimidation and violence can get away with it, and that has a lasting effect on voters in terms of allowing them to express themselves or having them feel free to express themselves in an election process. In terms of political tolerance, so in terms of violence and intimidation, we are operating below average because of the absence of measures to address it if it does occur. So even though there's not been rampant reports of violence, the fact that there are no adequate measures to respond to it if it does happen carries the potential of it getting out of hand as we get closer to the next election. In terms of political tolerance, we have fared above average in this assessment, where while since the military intervention in November, public perception is that communities are now much freer to express themselves than they used to be. Now, this is largely a perception issue, and it is yet to be seen if this is reality, given that we are progressing towards an election. So political tolerance during the assessment period was seen to be high in rural and urban communities, although we were able to witness some elements of intra-party violence during the assessment period, and some incidences where political tolerance was not exhibited at some platforms set up by civil society organizations to discuss democracy and governance issues. So during the assessment period, our performance relating to political tolerance was largely high and based on, again, like I said, largely the perception that citizens have. State media access was another indicator that we were tracking. With regard to this, state media access remained largely confined to the ruling party, which received positive coverage by the state media compared to the opposition coverage. So while we witnessed the opposition being covered in the state media, the bulk of such coverage remained largely negative, as opposed to the coverage being given to the ruling party by the same media. The law provides for the Election Commission to monitor media coverage in relation to elections, but this is only activated once an election has been proclaimed. And during this assessment, the election date had not yet been proclaimed. We have a recommendation relating to this. So state media access remains below average during the assessment, And the recommendation that we have is that going forward, the media monitoring role of the Election Commission must not be confined to the period from when the election is proclaimed, but must actually be done as early as is possible to allow for the exhaustive coverage of the reporting by the media of the entire election process and not just the campaign period. In terms of political party finance, as already indicated, political party financing was largely characterized by limited ZEC. They have the responsibility to transparently and accountably account for their resources. In our assessment, there were no public sharing of information regarding the sources of finances by all political parties in Zimbabwe, including those that are accessing public finances. So we are performing way below average in relation to the question of political party financing. On voter education, our assessment observed that voter education was largely extensive, contributing potentially to the increased participation of citizens in the voter registration exercise. The majority of citizens engaged indicated that they received voter education from the Election Commission and civil society organizations that were working with the Election Commission. So in terms of voter education, ZEC must be commended for at least improving their delivery of voter education compared to previous elections. So on voter education, we have been performing above average. In terms of the administration of the election process, our tracking process during the assessment period focused on elements of transparency and accountability as key principles that should be adhered to, as defined in terms of both the Constitution and the Electoral Act. Our fear is that in terms of election administration, ZEC has fallen short in terms of being transparent and accountable in its administration of key election process, particularly during this assessment period. So transparency has been disturbingly low. And the expectation is that the Election Commission considers steps it can take to improve transparency and accountability and independence in how they administer election processes. Overall, we think that as we get into the election phase of the election cycle, which kicked in once the proclamation of the election date was made, we have been performing average. This, according to our assessment, is not yet enough for us to guarantee that the credibility, freeness and fairness of our election will be achieved at this stage. So we recommend going forward the following. Number one, that in terms of voter education, ZEC considers improving extensive voter education to encourage citizen participation, and in our view, such voter education must touch primarily on the secrecy of the ballot. Voter education by the Election Commission must act to reassure citizens that their vote is secret and that their vote is safe, including ensuring that voters are informed when election processes and how election processes will be conducted. Secondly, the Election Commission must enhance transparency around the conduct of the outstanding key election processes. Well, you are well aware that the Election Commission still has to finalize the voters' roll. It still has to conduct voter education. It still has to recruit, train and deploy election officials. It still has to come up with procedures for polling. It still has to deploy a results management system for the election date. In all these processes, the Election Commission is encouraged to enhance transparency and accountability around these crucial processes. Thirdly, effective measures must immediately be deployed to mitigate against intimidation, violence, and hate speech that we have been witnessing, including the vote buying that we have been witnessing. These mechanisms must be led by the Election Commission, which has the constitutional mandate to administer a free and fair election. Elements relating to intimidation, violence, and hate speech affect negatively the conduct of free and fair elections. And in that regard, the Election Commission has a responsibility to address anything that compromises freeness and fairness in this election. Fourthly, equal access to state media by contesting parties must be enforced ahead of this election. So we've already started to witness this. But where the state media fails to comply with the provisions of the law by allowing for equal average, we need to be able to see the Election Commission taking measures to ensure that this practice is addressed. Fifth, the Electoral Act, in our view, remains unaligned with the Constitution. Going forward, and with the full appreciation that no further changes can be made to the election law once the election date has been proclaimed, we still encourage that going forward, ahead of, beyond this election, measures be taken to fully and adequately align the Electoral Act with the Constitution. We know that this cannot happen now, but we believe that this must remain on the table in terms of the recommendations that the Election Commission continues to make to the executive, to the Ministry of Justice, ahead of the post-election phase. So the expectation at the barest minimum is that the Electoral Act must be fully aligned with the Constitution. This is our presentation, and I will begin to take questions if there are any.
For these and other stories, visit our website www.263chat.com. Follow us on Twitter @263chat and like our Facebook page 263chat.